The worst part wasn't the hangover. It was the moment I realized the seat next to mine was still empty. I was 32, exhausted and deeply annoyed with myself.
The night before had been a mistake I didn't need to revisit. Cheap whiskey at an airport bar, a few conversations that went nowhere, and a morning flight I'd booked without thinking. My head pounded as I sank into the window seat, hoping for two things: silence and anonymity. The plane was nearly full. People shuffled past, stowing bags, murmuring apologies. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for whoever would land beside me. No one did. The middle seat stayed empty as the doors closed. A small mercy. I exhaled and leaned my head back, letting the hum of the engines dull the ache behind my eyes. For the first time that morning, I felt like the universe had given me a break. Then she stopped. She stood at the aisle, gripping her boarding pass too tightly, scanning the row like she wasn't sure she belonged anywhere. She looked pale, tense, eyes rimmed with something that wasn't sleep deprivation. When she noticed the empty seat between me and the aisle, her shoulders dropped a fraction, as if she'd been holding her breath since security. She sat down carefully, like sudden movement might break her. That was the moment everything shifted. I didn't know her name yet. I didn't know she was 26, or that she was flying toward a job she wasn't sure she deserved, or away from a life that had quietly disappointed her. All I knew was that she looked worse than I felt, and somehow that pulled me out of my own misery. I'm not the kind of man who believes in signs. After my last relationship ended, I learned to trust routines, not moments. Work trips, hotel rooms, return flights, that was my life. Clean, predictable, lonely, if I was being honest. The seatbelt sign clicked on. The plane began to taxi. She swallowed hard, fingers tightening around the armrest. Turbulence. I asked, my voice rougher than I meant it to be. She glanced at me, surprised, then nodded. A little. The word barely came out. Middle seat safer, I said. Statistically. She managed a weak smile. Good to know. That should have been the end of it. Two strangers exchanging polite noise before retreating into themselves. But when the plane lifted off and her breath caught, instinct overruled caution. I rested my hand lightly on the armrest between us, not touching her, just there. An unspoken option. After a second, her fingers brushed mine. Not desperate. Not dramatic. Just enough to say she wasn't alone. We didn't talk much at first. Just fragments. Where we were flying. Why? No details that could hurt. But with every mile in the air, the empty seat between us felt less like space, and more like an invitation neither of us had planned to accept. I didn't know it then, but that flight, taken on a bad morning in a worse state of mind, was the beginning of the only story I'd ever tell twice. Once to myself, and once because I still can't believe it happened. The first bout of turbulence hit, like a bad joke, timed perfectly for my headache. The plane gave a hard shiver, the overhead bins rattled, and a few people laughed too loudly to prove they weren't nervous. I wasn't nervous. I was just tired. But the girl beside me went still in a way that told me this wasn't ordinary discomfort. Her knuckles turned white around the armrest. The empty middle seat between us suddenly felt like wasted space. Not because I wanted company, because I could feel how alone she was inside her own skin. It's usually worse in the first 20 minutes, I said, keeping my voice low. Then it smooths out. She nodded without looking at me. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, but nothing came out. A flight attendant rolled past, cheerful and practiced, reminding everyone to stay buckled. The announcement ended with a bright, painless smile that didn't match the air in the cabin. The plane dipped again. This time her breath hitched. I didn't think. I just shifted my hand closer on the shared armrest, palm down, steady. A quiet offer. Not dramatic. Not forced. Her fingers found mine like she'd been waiting for permission to be human. For a few seconds, she held on, lightly, carefully, then pulled back as if she touched a hot surface. Her cheeks flushed, and she stared hard at the seat back in front of her. Sorry, she whispered. Don't be, I said. Nobody wins awards for suffering silently. That earned a small sound from her, almost a laugh, almost a sob. It softened something in my chest I didn't like admitting was still there. When the cabin finally steadied, she unclenched her hands and took a slow sip of water from the bottle she'd been gripping like a lifeline. "I'm Michael," I said after a moment. It felt less like introducing myself and more like stepping into a conversation that had already started. She hesitated, then turned slightly. Up close, she looked younger than her face had suggested from the aisle, big tired eyes, a faint crease between her brows like she carried thoughts heavier than her luggage. "Allison," she said. "Nice to meet you, Allison." Her smile was cautious, like she didn't trust it to stay. I tried to look away, to give her space. But the truth was, the moment she said her name, she stopped being just a passenger beside me. She became a person, and that changed the air. "I'm not great at flying," she admitted, staring down at her hands. "I thought I'd be fine, but today feels like everything at once." "Bad day to feel everything at once," I said, then immediately winced as my head pulsed. "Trust me." She glanced at me. "You don't look great either." "Caught that, huh? You look like you lost a fight with an airport bar." It was the first time her voice carried a hint of humor. I couldn't help it. I smiled, despite the headache. "That's painfully accurate." Something eased in her shoulders. She looked out the small gap between us toward the window, then back. "So why are you flying?" "Work," I said. "Logistics. Warehouses, routes, deadlines. Glamorous stuff." Her eyes flickered with interest. "At least it sounds stable." "It is," I said. And then, because honesty came easier at 30,000 feet for some reason, I added, "It's also quiet. Too quiet, sometimes." She didn't ask what I meant. She just nodded like she understood anyway. "What about you?" I asked. Allison's throat moved as she swallowed. "New job," she said. "New city. That's big." "It is." She paused, then forced a breath out like she was making herself say it. "I'm trying to start over." I didn't push. I'd learned that people reveal the truth at their own pace, or not at all. The drink cart finally came by. I waved off coffee, waved off anything that might make my head worse. Allison accepted tea, then held it in both hands like warmth could fix more than just her fingers. When the plane hit another small shake, she tensed again. Not as badly as before, but enough. I shifted the shared armrest up slightly, giving her more room. Our hands brushed, and this time she didn't flinch away. She let the contact linger for half a heartbeat longer than necessary. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even flirting. It was simply two people choosing not to be strangers. And somewhere between the thin plastic cup of tea and the steady rhythm of the engines, the empty seat between us stopped feeling empty at all. By the time the captain announced our descent, the cabin felt different. Quieter. Not because people had stopped talking, but because the air between Allison and me had settled into something calm and familiar, like we'd known each other longer than a single flight. The hangover had dulled into a manageable throb. I barely noticed it anymore. She was telling me about the city she was moving to, how she'd only visited once, how the streets felt too wide and the buildings too tall, how she kept wondering if she was brave or just tired of staying where she was. "I told myself I could always come back," she said, staring out the window as clouds slid beneath us. "But it feels different when you're actually on the plane." "It always does," I said. "Commitment has a way of getting real at 30,000 feet." She smiled at that. A real one this time. It stayed. When the wheels touched down, the cabin jolted gently and applause rippled from a few scattered seats. Allison exhaled, long and shaky, then laughed under her breath like she couldn't believe she'd made it through. "See," I said. "You survived." "Barely," she replied. Then, after a pause, "Thank you. For earlier." "You didn't owe me thanks," I said. And I meant it. As the plane taxied, reality crept back in. Phones came out. Seat belts clicked open. People shifted forward, already mentally gone. I felt it too, the invisible countdown to goodbye. Allison slipped her phone from her bag, hesitated, then set it back. "So," she said carefully, "what happens now?" It was a simple question. It landed heavy. "Now we stand up," I said, nodding toward the aisle. "We wait too long to grab our bags." And then we pretend this was just a nice conversation. Her eyes searched my face, like she was deciding whether to let that be true. In the narrow aisle, surrounded by strangers who'd shared the same air but none of the same moment, we stood close. Too close for comfort. Not close enough to call it anything else. I don't usually talk to people on planes, she said quietly. Me neither. The line moved. Slowly. Painfully. At the door, the flight attendant smiled and wished us a good day. Allison stepped forward, then stopped, turning back to me like she'd forgotten something important. I'm glad you were sitting there, she said. So am I replied. The terminal swallowed her almost immediately. Crowds, rolling suitcases, announcements echoing overhead. I watched until I couldn't see her anymore, until it felt inappropriate to keep looking. I told myself that was it. That some moments are meant to exist only once, like turbulence or sunsets seen from above the clouds. Then my phone buzzed. A new contact request. Unknown number. This is Allison. I hope it's okay. I found your number on the boarding pass photo I took. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. It is, I typed back. I was hoping you would. Her reply came quickly. Coffee sometime? If starting over allows room for small risks. I didn't hesitate. I think it does. As I walked through the terminal toward my own exit, the noise of the airport faded into something distant and unimportant. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't replaying the past or bracing for the next obligation. I was thinking about a middle seat that hadn't been empty, after all, and how some goodbyes are only pauses, waiting for the right moment to turn into beginnings. Distance doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, between messages sent too late and calls that end too early. Allison and I didn't pretend the flight meant more than it did. We didn't rush to label anything. We started with texts, simple ones. Did you land okay? How's the city? Did you sleep? Small bridges across miles that felt larger at night. Then came the calls. Her voice sounded different through a phone. Softer. More careful. We talked while I cooked dinners I barely tasted, while she sat on the floor of her new apartment surrounded by half-open boxes. She told me about her job, long hours, polite coworkers, the constant pressure to prove she belonged. I told her about mine, about routines that hadn't changed, about how strange it felt that something important had. Weeks passed like that. Not fast. Not slow. Just steady. I booked a visit once, then canceled it. Told myself it was practical. Work was busy. Flights were expensive. The truth sat heavier. I didn't know if I had the right to show up in her new life. Tom noticed before anyone else. He always did. You smile at your phone like an idiot now, he said one night over beers. That's new. It's nothing, I said automatically. He didn't buy it. Long distance is a trap, he said. Especially when it starts in the air. I laughed it off, but the word stuck. So did the doubts. Allison mentioned a coworker during one call. Daniel. Helpful. Attentive. The kind of man who knew the city and offered to show her around. She spoke casually, but I heard the hesitation underneath. I think he likes you, I said. There was a pause. Maybe, she admitted. I don't know how I feel about that. Neither did I. The distance made every thought louder, every fear sharper. I didn't want to be a voice on a screen while someone else stood next to her in real life. The first argument came quietly. You don't have to protect me from disappointment, she said one night, frustration edging her voice. I'm not fragile. I know, I said. I just don't want to promise what I can't give. And what is that, she asked. I didn't answer fast enough. The silence stretched. When the call ended, it felt unfinished in the worst way. Days passed without contact. Then one evening, a message appeared. I don't want this to fade just because it's hard. I stared at the words for a long time. At 32, I knew regret well enough to recognize its early signs. I bought the ticket that night. No speeches. No expectations. Just a seat on a plane and the quiet certainty that some risks are worse to avoid than to take. When I landed, the city felt unfamiliar, bright and sharp. I texted her. I'm here. She replied a minute later. Where? Near the airport, I wrote. There's a cafe across the street. She arrived 10 minutes later, breathless, eyes searching the room until they found me. When they did, everything else blurred. We didn't speak at first. She stepped close, and I wrapped my arms around her like it was the most natural thing in the world. She fit there, perfectly, like distance had only taught us where we belonged. "I was scared you wouldn't come," she said quietly. "I was scared not to," I replied. We sat together until the cafe lights dimmed, talking honestly this time about fears, about timing, about choosing something without guarantees. When she leaned in and kissed me, it was gentle, sure, and completely real. The distance hadn't broken us. It had clarified everything. Not because I'd planned it. Not because it made sense. I booked it because I was lying in a quiet apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of Allison's laugh through my phone for the third time that night, and realizing I didn't want her voice to live only in calls and messages. For weeks, we'd existed in fragments. Morning texts, late-night conversations that stretched longer than intended, photos of ordinary things, her coffee cup on a new desk, the view from my hotel window, a street light glowing in the rain. Distance made everything careful, honest, and exhausting. She never asked me to come. That mattered. The city greeted me with unfamiliar streets and a nervous energy I hadn't felt in years. I walked to the cafe we'd mentioned half-jokingly in one of our calls. A small place near the airport, warm lights, nothing special. Except she was there. Allison stood when she saw me. Just stood, like her body had decided before her mind could catch up. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she crossed the space between us and wrapped her arms around my shoulders. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't dramatic. It was steady, grounding, like we were confirming something we already knew. "You came," she said quietly. "So did you," I answered. We talked for hours. About the job she was learning to navigate. About the way my work suddenly felt less empty. About fear, the kind that doesn't shout, just waits. There were no promises on the table, no grand statements. Just two adults laying out the truth without armor. Later, as evening settled in, we walked by the river. The city lights reflected in the water, fractured but beautiful. She slipped her hand into mine without looking at me, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "I was afraid this would feel different in person," she said. "And?" I asked. She stopped walking and turned toward me. "It feels clearer." I leaned in then, slowly, giving her time to step back if she needed it. She didn't. The kiss was gentle, certain, unhurried. No rush to prove anything. Just a quiet yes. We didn't talk about the future that night. We didn't have to. Some decisions aren't made with words. When I flew home 2 days later, the middle seat beside me was empty again. But this time, it didn't feel like a gap. It felt like space waiting to be filled. We kept choosing each other after that. Not perfectly, not without doubt, but honestly. Sometimes I think about that first flight, the hangover, the bad mood, the empty seat I thought was a gift of solitude. I didn't know then that the best things don't arrive loud or obvious. They sit quietly beside you, waiting for you to look up. And when you do, your life doesn't change all at once. It simply turns.